itself is going to be a little bit interesting because not only do I have my own materials that I always teach, at the end of last year, I was fortunate enough to be invited to a webinar by John Cresswell, who is considered the father of mixed methods. And, you know, he is one of the more prolific authors out there who talk about mixed method designs and how to go about it. And that's why this afternoon I spent a bit of time adding in a few extra pieces of content, because there were some really interesting nuggets that I thought, nuggets of information from his presentation that I wanted to share here. My own presentation is very much an introduction to mixed methods. What do you need to know? What do you need to get out of it? His gave a few extra nuances, which I thought were really worth including. In fact, there's a lot more which I'll start putting up over social media in the coming couple of weeks to share. But I wanted to sort of give a good overview of what do you need to think about as you go into a mixed method study, or you consider the mixed methods approach to research. The objectives for tonight are quite simple. Understand the notion, the relevance of mixed methods research as a methodology that we can employ in our own research. To understand when to use a mixed methods approach. And I think, at risk of giving away my discussion in a few minutes, not every piece of research lends itself to mixed methods. Mixed methods is a direction the research world is heading in. It's a nice to have, but you are not losing brownie points by not using mixed methods. So, it's not a must do, but it certainly is, if it works for your research question, then it is worth considering, how do I engage with it? The third one is examine the key decisions that you make as a researcher when choosing a mixed methods approach. To explore the various permutations involved in a mixed methods approach. And what I'll do here is I'll go through the core potential mixed methods designs, because it's about how the interplay between qualitative and quantitative, how they feed into each other, how you integrate data, and ultimately how you get something that helps your research as an output. So we'll look at the different ways that can work and how qualitative informs quantitative and so forth, so that you can then say, oh, okay, I think this is the most sensible, most logical for me at this stage. And the final thing I want to do is talk about some potential ethics issues that are associated with mixed methods. And those of you who have followed me for a while know that I put a lot of weight onto understanding ethical considerations. And I do this not because I want you guys to have the most ethically perfect dissertation possible. I think understanding ethics issues helps make you a stronger researcher. Your negotiation of those ethics issues makes you a good researcher. So that's why I put that in there, because I think it helps us with our professional development. Now, to start for the evening, let's just look at what I call the usual definitions. So in general, mixed methods research represents research that involves collecting, analyzing, and interpreting quantitative and qualitative data in a single study or in a series of studies that investigate the same underlying phenomenon. So we might involve both in our study, or we might do a quantitative study first and then a qualitative study separately that we publish. And then we bring the two together. Now, I've seen that over the years in a lot of entrepreneurship research, where there will be quantitative studies first. And then, 6 months later, out publishes or out pops a qualitative study, which gives some different context. And then comes one that ties them all together. Now, as PhD candidates, which most of us are, we're looking at how we bring it together as one. But do recognize that you might have done, for example, you might have spent the majority of your dissertation doing a quantitative study with some fantastic output. And post dissertation, you might say, oh, let me put a qualitative lens to this, and let me bring or tie the two together, which is perfectly acceptable. If we go to the father of if we go to the father of mixed methods, Creswell, mixed methods research is a research designed with philosophical assumptions as well as methods of inquiry. Now, I'm going to spend some time on those philosophical assumptions. As a methodology, it involves assumptions that guide the direction of collection and analysis of data, and the mixture of qualitative and quantitative data in a single study or series. Its central premise is that the use of quantitative and qualitative approaches in combination provides a better understanding of the research problem that either approach alone could. I think that's important because I do have a couple of slides looking at the philosophical assumptions that underpin this. And I don't want to spend a lot of time because, I listened to Creswell for an hour talk about philosophical assumptions. I don't want to do a repeat of that. But I think it is important for us to look at an understanding of where we stand as a researcher, our worldview, which I will talk about, because that helps us decide. Now, those of you who have known me for a period of time, I'm a qualitative researcher. I'm historical. I like archives. I like documents. I like narratives. I hate numbers. And, my worldview is very, very focused on telling the story rather than aggregating the data. And as such, if I engage in a mixed methods approach, I still have to be honest to myself and say qualitative overrides quantitative. That doesn't mean it has to be the same for you. That's simply how I view research and how I view the academic world in which I operate. And that's my personal opinion. I don't need you to say, yes, Craig, full on, you're right, because I'm not right. I'm right for me. I'm not right for everybody else. So when we understand how we understand knowledge and how we understand research, that helps us to think, how do I use mixed methods? And for me, qualitative will always override quantitative. I will use quantitative as a support, as a backup, as a triangulation, rather than as a core. But what I do is I acknowledge the fact that because this is my way of seeing the world, that this is how my research comes out, which means if you take my research later on and you say, I want to do something more with what Craig's just done, actually you can say, well, I'm going to change the lens. I'm going to show that getting that abstraction from the quantitative side of things is going to help me see it in a new way. And then you can actually proceed with that. But that also shows that you're giving your worldview, which is extremely important for us as well. Okay, really simple, a methodological dichotomy, and it really is the very old quantitative versus qualitative debate. I'm not here to influence you to become a qualitative researcher. I think we all find our own path, and we should. But I just wanted to put some of the, I guess, terminologies that are associated with the qualitative quantitative debate into here, just to get us to think. So in quantitative, we talk about objective reality. We see the numbers, we see the proof that's done. We see causal. What is the link between what causes something else? We often use the word detached because quantitative research can give us vast data. Quantitative research can really help us look at those numbers and the trends and the patterns, but it's detached because we look at data points. We don't look at people. And if you look on the qualitative side, my matching word there is human intentions. And it's really that interaction, that's that identification, that's what we would call voice, the voice of the individual, the voice of the community that will come through. We talk in quantitative about samples and populations. It's contrived. We talk about variables, numerical, statistical. My favorite word, impersonal, which I kind of just touched upon. But those are some of the terms. Now, all of these terms are quite acceptable as, not features, but characteristics of how quantitative is. On the qualitative side, we talk about subjective reality. And, the objective subjective thing is going to come in during my conversation tonight. We talk about meanings, human intentions, being personally involved, because we're probably interviewing, we might be doing focus groups, we're part of those narratives, we're finding ways to elicit narratives out of the individuals. We might be looking at study cases. It's not case studies, but looking at study cases. We're taking a very small snapshot to get a depth understanding that might then inform a larger sample. We talk about actors in their natural settings. We talk about verbal and pictorial data, so a very different style of data that we can get. But we're also generalizing case studies. If you use me as a case study of a historical qualitative researcher, I am just that, a case study. I am not typical of every historic qualitative researcher out there, just as you as unique individuals are not typical of others in your field as well. So it still is a case study scenario. We have a basic typology of method choice. And I've only put this up because I want to make one point. Now let's go down the diagram. We have mono method where you might do quantitative, you might do qualitative. You do it on your own. But then you have multi-method or multiple methods, and the multi-method sort of splits up. And here's where I want to make sure that we don't get ourselves too confused, because mixed methods is about the integration of qualitative and quantitative together. So it is getting the numeric and it is getting the narrative and finding ways to integrate and draw them together to make our conclusions. But we also have multi-method. And multi-method is where we use, say, 2 or 3 qualitative or 2 or 3 quantitative methods. Now, that's not mixed methods. Multi-method might be me doing observational research and then a follow-up using focus groups and or interviews. Now, that's multi-method using 2 different qualitative techniques. But it's not mixed methods. It doesn't bring the numeric with the narrative. So don't say, oh, I want to do observation. The observation will inform me. From that I'm going to do focus groups. And from those focus groups, I'm going to do some very specific interviews. Now, that's fantastic. And as a multi-method study, to me, that makes a lot of sense. You know, you're really building on, you're getting that framework, but it's not what we would call mixed methods. So when, you know, if you choose to do that approach, for example, when you do that approach, don't confuse it in your dissertation and your writing and say, I did mixed methods because I used 3 different methods. That is multi-method only. Mixed methods is that combination. Now let's move on from there. The first thing I'm going to ask is, do you have the research skills? And I put this in there, A, because this was actually the first thing that Creswell asked in his session. And I thought, actually, it's really important because, you know, we often have to remember that the skills involved in research are quite significant. And, you know, you guys come to the programs that we at the Third Degree offer, and, you know, we're absolutely happy to make those available. And that's part of the learning. And as you will find other ways, just as I find other ways, including having to learn quantitative skills for myself, you know, we find other ways to do it. But really, I'm going to ask you, do you have these 5 skills, or do you recognize where you need to improve on them? Because that's the key thing. You know, until we get our PhD, we don't have that key to the door yet, but we have to teach ourselves. And if we say, look, I'm really terrible at dealing with people and asking, you know, questions in an interview, you can learn how to do that. And, you know, we're here to help, as many others are. But the 5 skill sets that you need, and these 5 are very important. Now, they're also the reason Farrell and I started the Third Degree, because we need to have these skills as an ability for us to be able to undertake and communicate research. So we start with quantitative skills. This might be basic statistical analysis. This may be more complicated. You know, I hate numbers. I do understand a bit of statistics. I can function, not necessarily enough to actually do a fantastic job, but I also recognize that I have to improve that, and I learn what I need to be able to do. So if you're lacking in quantitative skills, find ways to embrace them, or find people that will help you, but make sure that you understand the outcomes. So for example, if I do, you know, a large survey and I need to do a whole lot of statistical tests, I'm probably going to pay someone. You know, that's very much me. It's not so much that I know how to do the tests, but it's when I see the results that I understand how to interpret those results correctly and what that means for my bigger picture of research. So it doesn't mean go and learn every single skill. It means what you need to know is a certain part. Make sure you understand that, and that you can defend it later by telling or explaining to others what it is. We look at qualitative skills, interpersonal, communicating with people, eliciting information, getting new information from individuals and asking questions and all that sort of stuff. Then we move into mixed method skills. Now, this brings us something different. This is, you know, I use these 2 examples, triangulation, synthesis. It's about integration, which is the key concept I'm going to come back to through my discussion tonight. But this is about being able to take very different types of data points and to be able to see how they overlap, what that overlap means, and to generate a reliable and credible understanding of those findings. So the very basic is triangulation. You get, several different data points, you overlap them together and you see, does that work as true? That may be a very simple skill, but it can become incredibly complex as you get into larger data. The fourth skill is writing skills. The writing for a mixed methods approach is going to be a little bit more complex than if you use a mono method approach, a singular method, because not only do you have to explain the method, you have to explain the interrelationships. You have to then explain data in multiple formats. You have to explain the triangulation and synthesis of that data. And then you have to write that up as a set of conclusions. So it is more involved. It is more complicated than a mono method study. But if we can write a mono method, we can write for mixed method as well. And the final skill that's important is skills in receiving feedback. Now, I'm going to call that back to synthesis. We get feedback from so many places. But at the end of the day, I might do a quantitative pilot study. Out of my quantitative pilot study, I learn some things. I then jump into a qualitative approach to really delve deep into the issues. And the responses I get do not parallel what the quantitative pilot suggested for me. Now, my job here is, look, to understand that I'm being told different things. And in being told these different things, I've got to adapt to that. And I've got to say, well, how in my mind am I going to comprehend? And then how am I going to continue? Because it's like, just having something hit you in the face. But the skills in receiving feedback also go to, supervisors who say to us, look, I don't think these add up the way you think these add up. Or I don't think, we're going in the right direction. Or, oh, wow, we've got something that was unexpected. How can we make that a feature of the dissertation that we are writing? So I think these skills are very important. I think what is also extremely important out of this is to recognize, where am I as an individual researcher? Where am I with each skill? And how do I fill in the gaps? What do I need to do? So for me, my qualitative skills are fine. My mixed method skills are actually quite good. My writing skills, yeah, not so bad. Feedback, I'm not that great at. Quantitative skills, I'm terrible at. So I recognize that I have to work on the quantitative. I recognize that I have to work on the feedback. But I also have 3 years of, my PhD candidature in which to work on it. So I develop those as I learn, and I grow as I learn. Now I want to move into really when to use mixed methods designs. And so this is just some of the, some of the ideas before we step into actually how do we design something that is mixed methods, and what are those patterns going to be in that. But the things to think about, the things that I feel that are most important at the moment is the problem or the question that you are studying best addressed, best addressed using both qualitative and quantitative data. Now, I want to reemphasize what I had expressed before. Not every study is going to be enhanced by a mixed methods design. Many will benefit from the approach, but not everyone does. The key question I'm going to ask here is, will the collection of both types of data lead to a better understanding of your research problem? So by getting quantitative numeric plus qualitative narrative stories, does that give me a better understanding than if I only took a qualitative narrative or stories approach? And you have to answer that for your specific question. You might actually find out that, using one first and then following it up with a second does not enhance your understanding. It does not give you any advantage. And in that case, you can simply say, right, I'm only going to use one. But when you say, you know what, it actually helps me fill in the gaps. It helps me understand the trends and the patterns more, and it gives me explanations. Then you say, okay, this is when mixed methods is right for me. Now, it's not about being right for you as a researcher. Remember, it's always about being right for you. Well, actually, it's being right for your research problem. So we want to focus, we want to use it when it gives us a better understanding than a singular approach. We want to use it when one type of research is not enough to address the problem or to answer that research questions. Sometimes we need that when we want to validate findings that we have. From a pragmatism perspective, it's about practicality, multiple viewpoints, being able to showcase that many factors come to the table. It's also about, bias. Well, I've called it biased and unbiased. But at the end of the day, it is about transparency in your research. It's about not being biased towards something. And this is where our worldview comes into it, showcasing what our worldview and how we believe research is, showcasing that actually tells others our biases. They can then take our research and they can adjust according to that. And then it's also about the difference of subjective and objective. Sometimes we want to incorporate a qualitative component into an otherwise quantitative thing. Sometimes we need sound bites effectively. Oops, let's just mute a couple of people. There we go. Sometimes we need sound bites. And let's use the correct terminology, sorry, case studies. Sometimes in order to showcase the trends that we get quantitatively, sometimes having a voice from the community to express how they experience those trends actually makes our research much stronger. Sometimes we also need to build from one phase of a study to another. Now, this is where I look at things like pilot studies. And this is where myself as a researcher will embrace a mixed methods approach. And I have done this with previous projects where I have looked at a quantitative pilot in order to inform a qualitative impact discussion. So, we might want to explore qualitatively first to talk about what are the key issues, and then we develop an instrument. And I know people who have gone out, they've done pilot interviews. From those interviews, they've talked about a number of different issues, but maybe only with 10 or 15 people. But they've talked about a number of issues, and then they've come back and they've converted that into a quantitative instrument. They've got a better understanding of the issues. They've got a better understanding of the perspectives of those issues. And they've been able to convert that into a very strong survey or questionnaire to get quantitative results from a much bigger sample size. And sometimes we follow up a quantitative study with qualitative approaches, so focus groups, interviews, observational study, diaries and journaling and all that type of thing, to try and get some more detail. We want to understand individual motivations and individual responses to that. So these are the times when we use mixed methods. I'm going to add one more that's not in, oh, sorry, there's one more I've forgotten, and then I'll add one more. We might want to involve community-based stakeholders, especially if we are involved in an action research, or if we are doing a professional doctorate, a Doctor of Business Administration, for example, where the focus is not on an academic research question, but the focus is on solving a practical business or real life situation that is there. The one that I wanted to add, which I've now got to remember, sorry, give me a second. I've completely forgotten what I was going to add. Never mind, we'll move on to the next slide. There are some examples of mixed methods. You know, interviews and questionnaires, performance tests and observation, questionnaires and follow-up focus groups, document analysis, performance tests, questionnaires, interviews. All of these are mixed methods. It's simply taking a couple of different things, bringing them together, and then seeing how they fit together in the overview. Now, some key characteristics that we want to think about as we are considering mixed methods. First, what is your rationale? So are you trying to test findings of first phase? Are you explaining results of a first phase? So you want to take you know, a pilot and go more detailed, or in this case, it's not a pilot. Are you simply finding new ways or additional ways to explain what you observe and what you see? Are you, trying to provide a more complete understanding than either qualitative or quantitative alone? Now, I put this in here because two things. As a researcher, it is your responsibility to understand why you have chosen a particular approach. Don't tell me as a potential supervisor, don't say to me, I want to do interviews because they're easy. Well, they're not easy for one, but they might be for you. And that's cool, but that's not a justification. That's a laziness. So from that, we sort of really want you to defend yourself. And you have to defend yourself in two ways. First, you need to defend yourself in the proposal. And, your decision to use a mixed methods approach, 85% of the time will be identified prior to you writing your research proposal and prior to you defending that, to your supervisors and to perhaps other academics. But you're also going to have to defend it at the end of the process as well. You've written your dissertation, you're doing your viva. Did a mixed methods approach serve you well? And again, it's a defense. So it really is, creating that rationale, understanding why you're doing it has got to be logical. It's got to be backed up by literature. And I'm not talking about backed up by mixed methods literature. It needs to be backed up by literature for your discipline that showcases the mixed methods approach is going to give you more complete answers or explanations for where you've got. Now you're going to be looking at collecting numeric data, text data, pretty simple. Let's move into what's important. And this is a base consideration, okay? So it's one of the early ones I think about. It's about priority and sequence. And really, I'm just going to put it as simply as I can. We have chosen that a mixed qualitative and quantitative approach is sensible for us. Woohoo, great, no issue. Now you've got to defend. So let me come back to your rationale. Let me come back to that word defend or defense. You have to defend what order you are using them in i.e. sequence, and what order of importance, i.e. priority, they take. So from a priority perspective, we look, is quantitative and qualitative carrying equal weight? Are they partners in this research journey? Or are we using one as a pilot to help us shape, and the other is still going to be the dominant? So for me, as a qualitative researcher, I will do a simple quantitative approach first to get some ideas. It's probably worth 10% in terms of priority. With the qualitative approach, i.e. what I really wanted, because my worldview, okay, is 90%. Therefore, at least I've acknowledged, I believe the qualitative approach to be more significant, more important, more viable in the study. So that's priority. Is quantitative more than qual? Is qualitative more than quant? This doesn't mean in your dissertation you have a sentence that say, I believe that quantitative is 10% and qualitative is 90. But for you as a researcher, you've got to be able to say, I see the superiority of qualitative, but I see the contribution of quantitative. That's fine. Then we come into sequence. And I think if anything, I'm going to say sequencing is more important, because let me go back to priority for a second. I just thought of something. If we go into it and say, for example, I go into it with that 10-90 perspective, I do a quantitative survey to get me started, and then I use qualitative to go in depth. Now, my original intention is 10%, 90%. Nothing wrong with that. But as I go through, as I see the results that I'm getting from my 10%, I might actually come to a realization. I might have an epiphany. I might come to the realization that, wow, this quantitative data is pretty impressive. And suddenly my 10-90 becomes 40-60. So what we think of priority at the early stages, at the planning stages of our research, may change as we interact with the data. So, in one hand, I say, look, think about priority, think about sequencing, but also on the same, flip of that, the other side of the hand, I'm going to say, have that flexibility to follow the data that you get, because you never know that what you think will be the outcomes shine through in very different ways. And when you integrate those two sets of data together, you might suddenly realize that what you considered was not priority actually outshines or outweighs, carries more weight than it originally did. And that's going to influence your findings, your analysis, your findings, your conclusion. So all I say is, if you're going down that mixed methods approach, be prepared to be flexible. Be prepared to be adaptable to it, to the data, to the findings, because it may play a different role along the journey. Now that comes into sequencing. Am I doing quant first before qual? Am I doing qual first before quant? Or am I doing them consecutively? Now, this is where I'm going to come into a few diagrams in a few minutes for you. I think that's, probably the easiest way. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the diagrams because honestly, A, I'm going to put them up on social media. B, I'm going to share a resource through social media that will help you. And if you want a couple of books on mixed methods, I have a few that I can share individually with people through WhatsApp. So, there are things that I'll give, but I also don't want to spend too much time on it, because at the end of the day, when we go in with such rigid planning, we still have the problem that our research will take a life of its own. And for us as researchers, we want to focus on adapting to that. Now, there's a couple of key decisions in choosing a mixed method study. The level of interaction between qualitative and quantitative. So this is where I'm going to talk about integration in a couple of minutes time, okay? But it really is about how do the two unique data sets, because they come from different data collection processes, but how do those two unique data sets interact with each other to give us something that makes sense? We then have to look at the priority of the strands, which I talked about before, is qual over quant, quant over qual, or do we have to do something a little bit differently? Mixed methods, most academics who teach methodology, and myself included to some extent, but most of us say choose two methods, quantitative first, qualitative second, bang, there's your dissertation. But you might do quant, qual, quant. You might actually have a repeat quantitative that goes into a qualitative. The qualitative tells us more. We get a bigger quantitative that tells us some more, and we go back to qualitative. So we can actually really mix things up, shape things up, and use different strands for different purposes. Now, that also comes into the timing of the strands. Do I do quant first? Do I do qual first? At what stage in my research journey, at what stage in my dissertation, that 3 years, and I know everybody's different, so I'm just saying 3 years. In what stage in that 3 years doctoral journey am I going to use the first strand? Am I going to use the second? So, for example, when I am formulating my research proposal, I may choose to use one of the strands then to help me. So I know somebody, and I think they're here tonight. They did a very simple qualitative set of interviews first in order to get an understanding about an issue that informed their research proposal, so that they could then develop a questionnaire instrument for their actual research. So that's your pilot in a way, but the timing is, look, I'm using qualitative at the proposal stage, I'm using quantitative at the data collection stage, and I'm bringing the two together for my discussion stage. It might be different. It might be, look, actually, at my proposal stage, I already know my methodology. In my data collection stage, I'm using qualitative and quantitative. I'm using them consecutively so that I can get the data that I need to bring a synthesis together. And that's the last part, is where and how do I mix the strands of the research that are there, and of the different components that I choose. Now, there are some limitations that we have. Before I move into integration, before I move into the models, before I move into ethics, okay? The limitations of a mixed method study. It can, in fact, be very challenging to implement. My apologies. Because let me go back a few things. Let me go back to this slide, the 5 different sets of skills. If my skills are not yet up to par, which is okay, it's, it is what it is. It is going to be hard for you as a researcher. I think a number of things here. A PhD, and I know there's a few master's students in the room tonight, and you're most welcome to be here, because all of this applies to you guys too, just not as tough. But at the end of the day, a postgraduate research piece is designed to challenge you as a researcher. It is not about getting perfect research. As a supervisor, I don't give a crap about perfect research. What I care about as a supervisor is how you grow as a researcher. Sometimes our research does not go anywhere near what we intended. It's okay. So be it. Learn from it. So on one hand, I want to say, look, we have to learn to develop these, we have to learn to develop these 5 skills, and they're very important, but we're not going to master or perfect all of them. But at the same time, what we should be doing is pushing ourselves to grow as researchers. The other limitation of mixed method is it increases the complexity of evaluations. And that's where I'm going to talk about integration in a minute, okay? Because as we look at the type of integration we require, it does become complex, and we get more data, we get more dimensions that we have to think about. So when you choose a mixed methods approach, have in mind not only your research and your research question, have in mind the workflow required. So for example, if I'm doing a master's degree and I decide to do mixed methods, I'm going to applaud you, because that's pretty ballsy, that's pretty ambitious. But don't create so much work for yourself. And the person that I'm speaking this to, you're in the audience, I know that. Don't create yourself a PhD project at master's level, okay? As you get into the PhD level, again, you want to get your research question answered. You want to get the dissertation done within 3 years. The PhD is a test. It's a journey, it's a test, it's a lot of things. But at the end of the day, you just want the damn thing done. So don't create too much work for yourself. When you become more seasoned as an academic, as a researcher, either at university or in industry, and you've got time frames and you've got more resources and all that, you can become more and more complex with how you structure the research, because you've had the experience and because you have different pressures. But at PhD level, don't push it, because it will only lead to factors that create negativity for you. Mental stress, it might lead you to the point of saying, I just don't want to continue with this research. And for some people it does, so be very cautious with that. The limitation next is it also relies on us being multidisciplinary researchers. I think that's a really good thing. If you came the other week to my webinar on interdisciplinary research, I'm all for that, because I think we can't live in that vacuum. But for many of us, especially those of us from certain societies are very rigid. I know there are a number of universities in Southeast Asia that if you don't have an undergraduate degree in your subject, they're not going to let you do a postgraduate. I come from a place where we sort of slide all over the place, as long as we can prove that we have the ability to develop. So I think it's great to become multidisciplinary, or interdisciplinary would be my preferred term here. Excuse me. But that's something you've got to ask yourself. Look, am I confident enough to knock on the door to a neighboring discipline so that I can understand some things, so that I can then inform my own study? And the final limitation is it requires increased resources. It takes more time and more money. So as you're planning your research journey, you have to be very cognizant, I guess, aware of what are your resource limitations. Now, as a PhD candidate, our primary audience tonight, as a PhD candidate, you're probably not rolling in money and people probably aren't funding you a lot. So you have, financial limits. But the most important thing to remember is you have a time limit, 3 years. Now, I know some people say, you can do a PhD in 4 or 5, it's fine. If you are getting a scholarship, you are getting 3 years. So time means a lot. And I don't mean any disrespect, because anybody who completes a PhD, has my full respect. But I've seen people that have taken 10 years to get a PhD. 10 years is a lot of time to invest. And if we make research decisions that increase our time investment, it's actually not ideal for our future. Because I look at it a different way. If I want to hire you into my university department and you have spent 10 years doing your PhD, I am not going to get a lot of research out of you while you work for me. So it's worked to your disservice. Congratulations having the fortitude going through it. But at the end of the day, I want to see that you can make intelligent decisions that bring your research together in a timely and prompt manner. So, my whole point to here is, don't make a project that is bigger than it needs to be. That's probably advice you're not going to get from a lot of people, because it's about, hey, you've got some interesting stuff, go find the answers. But as we look at a PhD itself, don't make it too ambitious. All right, let me talk about integration. And this is something, this is what I've put into my discussion, really based on listening to John Cresswell last November, last December. And it was because he really highlighted the fact that often we make a decision based on where we think we are going, but we don't always, consider how we're going to get the data to come together. And I think that's really important for us. And I wanted to include it tonight, not as fully as he did, but I wanted to include it tonight because I think part of our decision processes of, going and saying, I want to do a mixed method study, part of our decision processes has got to be, how am I actually bringing all of my data together? And that's what we call that's what we call integration. It refers how we bring together qualitative and quantitative data in a mixed method study. And Cresswell proposes, look, there are actually 3 core ways to do it. We can either merge the databases together, which becomes a convergent design. So we find a way of, totally overlapping that they all tell us something. So maybe our quantitative gives us a number of fixed answers. Our qualitative research pads that out with narratives, exact same questions, but we get a richer data from it. So we discover that, 83% of PhD candidates do not like their supervisor. And then we have, from a database of 300 interviewees, we have rich narrative of stories as to why people did not like their supervisor, anecdotes and so forth. So that's how we can merge the two. We can connect the 2 databases together. So this becomes explanatory or exploratory sequential design. Now, these are the diagrams I'm going to show you in a few minutes, okay, in the next section of the presentation. Or we can embed the core designs into a framework or process, and these become complex or complicated designs. But it's about looking at how do they play a different role as part of a developmental process or part of the design of a theory. Now, we have to ask, or we have to answer for ourselves the following question. What do you hope to learn from your integration? So if we're looking at convergent, and again, as I said, the designs will come through in a few minutes. So if you're looking at the terminology and saying, what's this? It's going to come up really soon. If we're looking at a convergent style design, to what extent do the qualitative and quantitative results converge, i.e. come together? Where are the overlaps? Where are the outliers? Where are the differentiation? Where are the support versus the contradictions that come with this? If we look at an explanatory approach, in what ways does qualitative help to explain quantitative results? So how do we take a set of quantitative results, go deeper with a qualitative narrative, and how do we use those narratives to actually explain and justify or emphasize the results that we got from our earlier quantitative? And the final one, exploratory. And there's a little bit of a worldview in here too, because as I look at it and I think about it, I really do feel that Creswell is a quantitative researcher who's just tried to open up the world. But if we look at exploratory, in what ways do the quantitative results we get generalize the qualitative findings? So as we've got these rich narratives and we've got these stories, we've got these experiences from individuals, how do we use quantitative results to be able to say, well, we saw in the narrative, this was happening. 65% of people are now actually, following in line with that. Now, I'm going to move on to the diagram. So I'm going to make this section quite quick, but I need to take a 3-minute break. So I'm just going to ask you guys, go to the bathroom, go grab a drink, grab a snack, go outside for a cigarette, whatever you need to do. I'll be back in 3 to 4 minutes, and then I'll move on to the second section, which is the type of mixed methods designs and some of the information. And then we're going to talk about how we maintain quality with our research. And I'm going to talk briefly about worldview and ethics as well. Okay, so take a few minutes and then I'll be back very shortly.
Hello, everyone.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for that. Just gave me a time to get a bit more of a drink and also to see some of the questions that have popped in. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to rush through the strategies because, as I said, I'm going to put this up on let's go back to here. Just get somebody to mute again. They muted themselves. Wonderful. I'm going to rush through this part because I'm going to put it up on social media tomorrow. But it's also something that, you know, you have to do your own reading about and understand. And if you're really, you know, you really want to thrash it out with somebody, make an appointment and I'll happily talk about it. I want to sort of go on to what's coming after this, which is issues of quality control, worldview issues, and ethics, because I think they're very, very important for us. But let's start. I'm going to go through, I think, 6 mixed methods approaches, and I've got it in 2 ways. So as I said, I'm going to put this up on social media, so you'll be able to download it. Not an issue. I'll put it in our chat groups and everything. So, you know, I can go through it quickly, but you can also grab the images and the text words tomorrow. The first one is a sequential explanatory study, and it's really looking at using quantitative prior to qualitative. And it's simply, you know, quantitative data collection, analyzing your quantitative data, then moving into qualitative, analyzing that qualitative, then the, you know, the integration of the two, the interpretation. What does it all mean? So it's really simple. I'm just going to focus on the strengths and weaknesses. The strengths are that it becomes relatively straightforward. It's clear. There are distinct stages. It's easy to describe. You know, it makes your life relatively easy as a researcher. The weaknesses, though, is it's time consuming, because if you're giving, especially, you know, both phases equal consideration, you know, you're going to have a 3-month data collection period, then you're going to spend 3 months analyzing the data and interpreting it. Then you have to move into a new 3-month data collection period, and then a new 3-month, you know, analysis period. You've just spent a whole year. Wow, that's a lot of time. So, you know, it is a time-consuming thing, and this is why I say, do not set yourself up to spend so much time. Don't create more work than is absolutely necessary. We then have sequential exploratory, and this is where we do a qualitative collection first, a qualitative analysis, then we move into quantitative. Exactly the same as explanatory, but the role of qualitative and quantitative is different. Again, the strength is, look, it's straightforward. The weakness being time consuming. It's useful if we want to test elements of a theory. It's useful if we want to generalize findings to different samples. And it's also very useful if we want to develop an instrument, for example, a survey. Absolutely, you know, ideal. And both of these, whether you're looking at sequential exploratory or sequential explanatory, both of these are very baseline techniques, baseline options for us as researchers. And, you know, I'm going to say, this is going to sound quite nasty, but, If you want to wet your feet in mixed methods, this is the way to do it. You dip your toes in the water, you do a simple study like this, and then you move on. So this is the basic one. If we move into the next phase, we're looking at sequential transformative. And this is looking at the relationship between the information that we get, the data that we get, the integration of that data, between the qualitative and the quantitative, because we want to be able to transform, we want to be able to grow. And we're looking at things like vision, advocacy, ideology, frameworks. What we're doing is we're integrating the data during interpretation. So if I go back a couple of slides, we collect, we analyze, we collect, we analyze, and then we interpret. So it's like, we're getting two different sets of information at once. When we look at something that is transformative, we're getting the data at similar time periods, and we're using that data to build upon itself. So we're actually developing, to use modern terminology, we're getting real-time data to help us make real-time conclusions that evolve as we develop what we're doing. In terms of a strength, it's straightforward in terms of its implementation. The weakness is it's time consuming. Now, I think you're going to see the trend here. Everything in a mixed methods approach is theoretically going to be time consuming. Now, one of the challenges that you will face as researchers is, look, there's a very little guidance as to, due to the lack of literature on the transformative nature of moving from the first to the second. Now, there may have been more things published in the last few years, and I really do suspect people like Creswell and some of the others who are really leading the charge with this methodology, with mixed methods, probably have outputted a lot more things in the last couple of years when they've had time to do that. So do go and take a look for that as well. The next one is concurrent triangulation. And this is similar. I mean, we're taking separate quantitative and qualitative. We're looking at the collection, we're analyzing it, and we're comparing the analysis at the same time. So there is some similarity, but it's not sort of cyclical in a sense. It's two separate strands that are then being treated as one strand as we progress. So two concurrent data collection phases. Priority could be equal. Priority should be equal, but it could be given to either approach. The interpretation, though, even though it's, it's sort of concurrent, because the data is integrated at interpretation, it lacks or potentially could lack some convergence that will strengthen our knowledge chain, our knowledge claims or what we understand. So, it's not always going to give us totally comprehensive results. The strengths that we get is it's pretty familiar. In fact, I'm going to go as far as calling it pretty common sense. We get a shorter data collection time compared to our sequential methods. It offsets some of the weaknesses inherent to the design, to one design using both. So, there might be weaknesses in the quantitative, but the qualitative makes up for that fact. So there are some decent, sensible strengths that come into it. The weaknesses is it does require a great deal of expertise. So it's back to the strengths that we have as researchers to be able to study the phenomenon under consideration using two different methods. So as your first research project, this is going to be a tough one. If you decide to use this way, it is going to be a tough one, but it's manageable. It may also be difficult to compare two types of data, as well as to resolve discrepancies if and when they arise. Concurrent nested is really about how things are embedded in themselves. So two data collection methods, one is embedded within the other. And I noticed we've actually had a couple of questions that have come through. I checked those out during the break. And I think my answer to those questions is going to come back to this sort of approach. Data is mixed during the analysis phase. We're trying to get a broader perspective here. So, you know, it has some help. I think what's great about this, and I want to sort of point out a really relevant thing. Before qualitative research existed, before quantitative research existed, research existed. Now, what we call mixed methods research today is kind of what research was before we split it up into quantitative and qualitative. So to me, this is, you know, a really good way of getting a strong overview. The strengths here, I mean, I think this is natural, a natural approach to research in many, many ways, but don't quote me 100% on that. The strengths here is we can collect two data types simultaneously. We can collect quantitative and qualitative at the same time. That allows perspectives from both. So you might do, for example, a survey where you break out into very specific questions, subject to very specific narrative questions, open-ended questions, subject to the response from a fixed alternative answer. So, you know, we'll do an example. Do you believe in rainbows? Yes or no? If yes, now we get an open, an open response question. If no, we get a whole different set of open response questions. But instead of it being fixed alternatives, we actually get the chance to get the story, get the narrative from the individual. The weaknesses here is data needs to be transformed to allow integration in analysis. So sometimes it's not going to be in a format that makes it easy for us to work with. This might lead to issues we have with discrepancies. There's very little literature in this field yet. It's developing, but we don't have a lot of go-to best practice guides to really get us to do this. But I'm going to argue differently. I'm going to argue, look, this is what research used to be. Before we went down that whole 1970s quantitative qualitative school of thought, actually, this is how research was. So if we look at some of the really early research, we're going to get some very good insights in how to embrace this approach. Sorry, I should say the weaknesses, there may be bias in results because of the differing priorities that we assign to research design and the results that it gets from it. We then have concurrent transformative, two concurrent data collection phases that might work in a very different way. So in actual fact, you know, we're using mixed methods on a multiple scale, which becomes, you know, again, complicated for a early career researcher. A little bit of things, you know, the strengths, it can collect both qualitative, quantitative simultaneously, allowing the perspectives from each, getting the advantages of both methods, shorter data collection time. Again, it offsets weaknesses due to design. But similar problems is data needs to be transformed for integration. That's going to have issues. It requires a great deal of expertise and effort to study the phenomenon under consideration using two different methods. And this is where perhaps an interdisciplinary approach, you know, or an interdisciplinary background helps us. But it's also about recognizing that we as a researcher might be encroaching or embracing, you choose your word there, more than one worldview. You know, if we're trying to look at something through two different approaches, through two different lenses, that's a lot of extra work for us, but it's also very, very rewarding. There are some defining features that'll be put up. I want to move on to sort of the issues that we think about, because those diagrams you can find anywhere, you can learn about them. These are the things that are probably more unique to what I choose to talk about. So let's talk very briefly about quality control issues. Mixed methods are inherently neither more or less valid than specific approaches. So quality control, making sure that there is validation, there is credibility, is going to require a little bit more work. And that's what we have to be able to think about, making sure that the validity, the credibility of both the qualitative and the quantitative approach is robust. And secondly, as we're integrating them together, that we don't take shortcuts, that we don't make unprofessional assumptions about how we integrate the different data sets and how we choose to interpret those. So the final sentence I'm just going to put there, and I'll give you the reference to Baisley as well, but in short, there are established rules for controlling validity in standard qualitative and quantitative research. The same rules must be followed when methods are combined, but we have an extra layer of complexity, and this is my add. The extra layer of complexity is in making sure that as we work through the integration of the data sets, that we are following acceptable ethical principles and processes to really make sure that happens. Now, I kind of talked about this before, so I think I'm going to skip over this one. I want to talk about worldview, and I put the 3 question marks there because it's about what worldview is. Now, those of you who have followed me for a while, you might have come to a session I did last year on positionality. And I kind of use the word worldview when I talk about positionality sometimes, and it's not always 100% the same. So I want to make a sort of a very defined, how do I put it? A defined approach to worldview in this context. Worldview in the context of mixed methods. So Creswell and Plano-Clark use the philosophical assumptions in mixed methods research, a set of beliefs and assumptions that guide research. Now, we each have, whether we can identify them by a technical term, as you'll see the technical terms as we go down here, whether we can identify them by a technical term or whether we just say, look, I believe in this, we are guided by assumptions. I believe that the narrative is bigger than the number. I'm not really going to put a technical name to that because I'm not a fan of technical names, but it is my worldview. And that means I always put priority of qualitative over quantitative. That's how I am as a person. I always look to a story before I look to perhaps even overwhelming evidence of how that story is. We say that researchers bring to their inquiry a worldview composed of beliefs and assumptions about knowledge that informs their study. And that is true. Every single one of us does. If you sit and you think, what is my worldview? Do not expect to get an answer straight away. You might be sitting for days or weeks. You might come back to me in 10 years and say, hey, Craig, I think I finally figured out my worldview. But it's not important for you to get it straight away. What is important, though, is for you to think about the questions that I'm going to ask in a couple of minutes. Think about those questions and think about what your answer to those questions are. because that's what informs your worldview. Now, we select our worldview based on our scholarly community. So actually, our worldview is not ours. It's usually something that we've sort of clinged on to from some of our earlier lecturers, from some of our teachers, from those in our community. And we say, you know what, I think you're right. Your idea, your ideal makes sense. And then we convince ourselves that that's the correct way to do it. I know if I had had different lecturers at university, there is a very strong chance I could have turned into a quantitative researcher, because some of the other people that were there who could have influenced me were quantitative. But I kind of, I hung with a certain group, I followed a certain group, I ascribed to everything that they wrote, they talked about, they believed. And that kind of became my worldview in that respect. Now, we are trained as researchers, and every single one of us here is trained as a researcher. We might not have our PhD yet, but we're undertaking that training every single day of our lives. Every time we do anything academic, anytime we do anything in the community. And we get research experiences from our community, within our research community, that help shape us. So these help shape how we think about the research. And that's the important problems to study, the important methods we should be using, the important conclusions to draw. Now, here's the funny thing. As a researcher, we should be asking questions. We should be open to anything coming up. But at the end of the day, our discipline is actually training us to find very specific, predetermined answers. I might sound a little bit cynical about that, but when we do a research gap analysis, when we do a literature review, when we put together a research proposal, we're actually being pushed in a direction. We're not of free will following the question we had. We're using that question to frame it within all of these other contexts and then answer the question somebody else forgot to ask previously. And the final part of that is journalistic outputs for publication. So where are we going to publish? We have all these frameworks, all these paradigms, all these structures that have been drilled into us over the years. Now, that aside is just what it is. You might say I'm cynical. I mean, I certainly do. You might want to disagree with me. You're more than welcome to. The more we debate, the better. But what all of this does is it informs our statement or statements about our worldview. So this is us. The view that reality is either outside the person or inside the individual. So that's termed epistemology. The understanding about how reality is known or learned, that's termed ontology. The understanding of our values and biases that we each hold as researchers, that's axiology. The approach to conducting research, that's our methodology. And the approach to writing a study, and that's our rhetoric. Now, these become our worldview because, is knowledge constructed with or without us? How do we actually know knowledge is real? What is proof of something to you? Because 51% of people say it's real, does that make it real? These are very deep philosophical questions. And I'm going to say, look, you know what? We don't have to have an answer for all of this, but it is good to think about some of these issues and say, well, how am I pushed? Why do I believe something is real? What is the threshold? And how do I believe something should be communicated, i.e. the rhetoric? This sort of worldview statement can have the potential to be included in your project. And as you develop as researchers, maybe not your PhD, but further down the track, this is something that you're going to have a stronger, I guess, a stronger connection to. Now, there are 4 popular worldviews, and I'm going to put up not only the full reference to this, I've got to find that in my notes, but I'll put up some more details through our social media tomorrow about this. I don't want to get into them because they're really heavy, but you know, the 4 popular worldviews as applied in mixed methods research: pragmatism, critical realism, transformative, emancipatory, horrible word, and you'll see transformative came through in my diagrams before, and dialectic pluralist. Now, pragmatism is focusing on outcomes, consequences, practical solutions. It's simply about answering a question and finding a solution that works. Critical realism, it brings in, and you'll remember I had the, you know, subjective and objective earlier on in the discussion. You know, we're emphasizing subjective viewpoints, we're emphasizing objective realities, but we're also saying that theories are incomplete. And because they're incomplete, we need to do more work. The transformative is kind of like action research. You know, we're collaborating, we're involving the communities that are impacted. But we're also then attending to things like power, privilege, and inequality. And let me just make a statement that I like to make quite often to academics. I don't really want to buy into the North American arguments about privilege. The Black Lives Matter, Me Too, all of those actually scare the shit out of me because they're not something that were embedded in the communities that I grew up with. And because of that, I view them as an outsider. I struggle to see all of the nuances and I need to learn more. But I do look at privilege, and privilege is about one person having an advantage over somebody else. And no matter what our culture is, no matter how poor we are, as PhD students, we have a privilege. We have had more education than most other people on earth. We have a responsibility to help future generations. That privilege, access to something that many other people don't, becomes a responsibility as well. But that's also going to inform how we think about things. So it's heavy. And I don't want to get into it because I think I could have an argument and still not find, you know, an outcome or a solution that's remotely where it should be. But it is something that we have to, at some stage, think about for ourselves. You know, I went into a university a few months ago. I did a training program for the academics at the university. And most of them said they don't have any privilege. I said, well, first of all, you've all got PhDs. You're working for a private university, so you're being paid more money than you are at a government university. And then I said, just look at the beautiful offices you have. Go anywhere else in this country and find me those beautiful offices. You won't. That's privilege. Now, how does that come back to us? It shapes what we think is important or what we think is not important in the world. And that influences our approach as a researcher. Now, mixed methods brings that in because we can acknowledge these things and we can incorporate them. And the final one, dialectic pluralist, you know, it's supporting 2 or more paradigms engaged in respectful dialogue. And if we go back, let me go back to this as the diagram that I kind of want to look at here. It's looking and saying, look, there are a few ways that you can look at the same thing. Let's approach using different lenses. And then let's look at whether collectively the different lenses we have helps us see something in an alternative way. Now I want to move on to ethics, and I promise you I am 2 slides from finishing, and then we can move into a Q&A. I know it's quite a long session tonight. there are ethical concerns. Ethics comes into every single part of research, so there's nothing new here. But these are the ethics concerns or the ethics issues that you must take into account when undertaking a mixed methods based study. Participants must participate voluntarily. Common sense, right? Participants must understand the purpose and the procedures of the study. So they just need a little bit of extra information, what's come before, what's coming after. Participants must understand that they have a right to the copy of the results. Now, when I say this, it's never about giving them your dissertation or giving them raw results. Sometimes we just simply need to create a findings infographic or summary that we can share to all of our participants. And because we're using it, or we're getting their participation in different manifestations, we've got to make sure that everybody has the option to get that. Participants must understand potential benefits of the study and that their privacy will be respected. Now, if I'm doing a questionnaire, if I'm doing an interview, I'm already giving you anonymity, perhaps, or confidentiality, whatever, the privacy issues, right? Now, if I use that interview and then I develop a survey instrument, I've got to make sure that I don't say, well, person A suggested this. What is your opinion of person A? Because that gives another outlet where their privacy could be released to somebody else, either by you directly or simply by the structure of what they say. Sometimes it's very easy to identify a person based on the information contained or the information conveyed, rather than by saying, oh, it was Farrell, or, oh, it was somebody else. So, you've got to look at making sure that opinions that come through cannot be necessarily attributed to individuals by default of how they communicate. Researchers must understand the impact of their presence at research sites, ensure that these sites are left undisturbed. Now, this makes it sound like an archaeological study. Go dig up some bones, but it's not. I mean, if I go into an organization, and I'll use, if you don't mind me using you as an example, Daniel, I'm going to use you. You're interviewing CEOs. You're going into organizations. You're talking with key people. The disturbance is not what you can physically do in that geographical space. But your disturbance is who's involved, what type of questions are being asked, whether there is discomfort from that, whether there is concerns after your interview that you might have crossed the line. This is disturbance. So it's not about the archaeological thing, which actually could be a lot of fun, but it's simply about the intellectual engagement that happens during these processes at different venues that we are involved with. In this case, officers, senior management, and so forth. Care must be taken to identify, nullify any actual or perceived issues where power between the researcher and the participant could be abused. Look, my word privilege comes back here. I know privilege and power are two different things, but there is an overlap. And it simply comes down to, just because a pilot study told you one direction and a subsequent qualitative follow-up is not going in that same direction, it doesn't bring you to say, but all these people's surveys said you must be wrong, or you must be an anomaly, or whatever. It's simply about being adaptable. And remember what I said earlier. As you learn to be adaptable and go with the data rather than go with your preconceived notions, then you won't have an issue with this. Anonymity must be maintained during data analysis, data kept for a reasonable period of time. Nothing new there. Ensure that writing is free of bias towards any group. That's where editing comes in. Details of the study must be carefully explained within the actual report. so as to allow readers the opportunity to judge ethical quality. So it becomes, how good has been your description of the methodology and the processes? Now, my final slide before I go into Q&A is this a philosophical end, the death of mixed methods? And I'm kind of, let me be cynical here. And I said this earlier, mixed methods is wrong, not because methods should be kept separately, but because they should not have been divided at the outset. And you'll recall about 15 minutes ago, I talked about, the origin of research was mixed methods. It then got separated in the 70s, 60s and 70s. It then came together in the 90s and the double O's. And it's just another part of the cycle. Mixed methods, to be honest, is common sense and intuitive. But having said that, don't over create too much workload for yourself. Now, I have some references. I'll put this up. I'll make sure that goes up for you on our social media platforms tomorrow, along with a couple of other references that I've got that I didn't add in with my notes today. What I'll do now is I'll move over to Farrell to do a Q&A session.